The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the whole station had taken one sharp breath and forgotten how to let it out. I was standing at the observation window of Calder Station when the light above the docking bay turned red, and every alien around me stopped moving at the exact same time, as if someone had pulled a single string connected to all of them. My name is Daniel Cross. I am a human liaison officer, one of only 6 humans allowed to live and work on this station, under the old agreement between our people and the rest of the galaxy. For 3 years I had walked these halls, traded polite words with beings from 100 different worlds, and never once raised my voice. That was the job. That was the whole point of putting a human here. We were supposed to be the calm ones, the ones who smiled first, apologized first, and never ever reached for anything sharp. The alarm kept ringing. I turned to the nearest console and pulled up the feed. What I saw made my hands go cold. A human colony called Meridian, out on the edge of settled space, had gone dark. Not offline, not delayed, dark, the way a candle goes dark when someone closes their hand around the flame. The last transmission from the colony's small defense outpost was 11 seconds long, and in it, a voice I did not recognize said only one sentence before the signal cut. They crossed the line. I did not need anyone to explain what line he meant. 900 years ago, after a war that ended before any living person's grandparents were born, every major species in this part of the galaxy had signed a truce. Human territory was marked. Human colonies were marked, and every species, even the ones who did not like us, even the ones who thought we were strange or too quiet or too polite, had agreed never to cross that line with weapons drawn. Nobody had broken that agreement in 900 years. Not once, not even close. Until today. Around me, the alien officers on the station began speaking rapidly in their own languages, some of them backing away from their stations entirely, as if the red light itself might reach out and touch them. A Velkari trade officer named Sona Ithril, a being I had shared lunch with dozens of times, looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not curiosity. It was not even alarm. It was something closer to fear. The kind of fear you feel when you realize a sleeping animal in the room with you is no longer sleeping. "Daniel," she said quietly, "what happens now?" I did not answer her right away, because I honestly did not know. In 3 years on this station, I had never once seen the truce tested. I had grown up hearing about it the way children hear about old storms that happened before they were born. Real but distant, something from history books, rather than something that could touch my own life. Now it was touching everything. My comm unit buzzed. A priority channel, one I had never used before, the kind reserved for exactly this sort of moment. I answered it, and a voice on the other end, calm and clipped, gave me 4 words. Return to home space. That was all. No explanation, no comfort, just an order, delivered the way you might tell someone to close a window before the rain starts. I looked around the station one more time. The corridors that had always felt open and easy now felt like they were holding their breath along with everyone in them. A group of Threnian merchants who had been arguing over cargo prices an hour earlier were now standing in a tight circle, whispering. An old Velkari elder, someone I had only spoken to a handful of times, was staring directly at me from across the concourse, not with anger, but with something that looked almost like an apology, as though she already knew what was coming and felt sorry for it. I packed nothing. There was no time and, honestly, nothing on that station meant enough to me to slow me down. I walked to the personal transport bay reserved for human staff, climbed into the small shuttle assigned to me, and requested departure clearance. The clearance came through in less than a second. Nobody argued. Nobody asked me to wait. In 3 years, I had never once been allowed to leave a docking queue that fast. It told me everything I needed to know about how the rest of the galaxy was already reacting to what had happened at Meridian. As my shuttle pulled away from the station, I looked back through the rear viewport. Sona was still standing at the observation window, watching me go. She did not wave. She simply pressed one hand flat against the glass, the way you might touch the side of a ship that was about to sail into a storm you could not follow it into. The trip back toward human space took 4 days. I spent most of it trying to get more information and receiving almost none. Official channels were quiet, in a way that felt deliberate, rather than accidental. When I finally reached a relay station close to the border of our territory, I expected chaos, shouting, fear, something loud. Instead, I found silence. Not the silence of an empty place, the silence of a place where everyone had gone very still on purpose. Fleet officers moved through the halls without wasted motion. Nobody was raising their voice, nobody was panicking. If anything, the mood reminded me of a surgeon's room right before an operation begins, where everyone already knows exactly what they are supposed to do and is simply waiting for the signal to begin doing it. I found my assigned contact, a fleet coordinator named Owen Marsh, standing in a small briefing room with a datapad in his hand. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "You were at Calder," he said finally. I was. "Then you saw how the others reacted." I nodded. They looked afraid. Owen set the datapad down on the table between us. "They should be." I waited for him to say more, but he didn't, not right away. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out at the ships gathering in the distance, more of them than I had ever seen assembled in one place in my entire life. 900 years, Daniel," he said quietly. 900 years we have been the polite ones, the quiet ones, the ones everyone learns about in history and assumes we're always this calm, always this careful. Because we choose to be, I said. Owen turned to look at me, and there was something in his expression I could not quite name. Not anger, not excitement. Something older and heavier than either of those things. "We chose to be," he agreed, "because we were asked to. Because 900 years ago, we agreed to stop being something else." A cold feeling settled into my chest, the same feeling I had gotten watching Sona's hand pressed against that glass. "What were we before that?" I asked. Owen did not answer. He simply looked back out the window, at the ships gathering like a held breath finally about to be released, and said the only thing that mattered in that moment. "You are about to find out." Outside, more ships arrived every few minutes, gathering in formation with a quiet, practiced discipline that unsettled me more than any shouting ever could have. Nobody was rushing, nobody was scrambling. Every single person moved like they had rehearsed this exact moment 10,000 times in their sleep, even though nothing like this had happened in 9 centuries. I stood at that window a long time, watching my own people prepare for something I did not yet understand, and for the first time in my life, I felt a strange and uncomfortable thought settle into my mind. Maybe the rest of the galaxy was not afraid of us because we were weak. Maybe they were afraid of us because they remembered exactly how strong we used to be, and we had simply chosen, for 900 years, to let them forget. I thought about the elder on Calder Station, the way she had looked at me before I left, not with hate, but with something closer to sorrow. She had known something I did not. Every alien on that station had known something I did not. For 3 years I had walked among them believing we were equals, believing the quiet respect they showed us came from simple courtesy between neighbors. Now I understood it had never been courtesy at all. It had been caution, carefully hidden behind polite smiles and careful words, the kind of caution you show a door you were told, long ago, never to open again. Owen finally turned away from the window and looked at me directly. "Get some rest, Daniel. Tomorrow you report to the fleet command deck. There are people there who are going to want to hear everything you saw at Calder. Every word, every look, every small detail. Nothing is too small right now. And after that?" He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its calm edge, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. "After that, you are going to watch something happen that has not happened in 900 years, and I would not wish that sight on anyone, not even the people who forced us into it." I left the briefing room with those words following me down the corridor, heavier than any alarm, heavier than any red light. Behind me, through the window, the ships kept gathering, silent and patient, waiting for an order that every single one of them already seemed to understand. I did not sleep that night, not really. I lay on a narrow bunk in the visitor quarters of the relay station, staring at a ceiling I could not see in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of engines through the walls. Every few minutes I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, always steady, always unhurried, never once breaking into a run. That steadiness frightened me more than any panic could have. Panic is loud. Panic is messy. What I was hearing was the sound of people who already knew exactly what they were going to do next. By morning, I reported to the fleet command deck, a massive chamber built into the center of the station, ringed with screens, showing star charts, supply lines, and troop positions I did not fully understand. Officers moved between stations with quiet purpose. Nobody shouted orders. Nobody argued. It felt less like a military command center preparing for conflict, and more like a group of surgeons reviewing a procedure they had performed 1,000 times before, even though, as far as I knew, nothing like this had happened in living memory. A woman I had never met approached me as soon as I stepped through the door. She introduced herself as Fleet Director Helen Marsh, no relation to Owen as far as I could tell, though the coincidence of the name struck me as strange in a place where nothing else felt like coincidence. She was older, her hair silver, her eyes sharp in a way that made me feel like she was reading something written on the inside of my skull. "You were the last human eyes on Calder Station before the border closed," she said. It was not a question. I was. "Then you will sit with me, and you will tell me everything, not what you think matters, everything." I spent the next several hours doing exactly that. I described the alarm, the red light, the way every alien on the station had frozen at the exact same moment. I described Sona's expression, the Elder's apologetic stare, the strange calm that had settled over the station even before anyone understood the full scope of what had happened. Helen listened without interrupting, occasionally making a small note, never once reacting with surprise, as if every detail I gave her confirmed something she already suspected, rather than revealing something new. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. "Do you know why the galaxy panicked the way it did?" she asked, before they even knew the full details of what happened at Meridian. "Because the truce was broken." "No," she said, "because they know what breaking the truce means, not what it might mean, what it does mean. They have known it for 900 years, and they have spent every single one of those years hoping they would never have to find out again." I felt that same cold feeling from the day before settle back into my chest. "Find out what?" Helen did not answer right away. Instead, she rose from her chair and walked to a console at the side of the room, tapping in a sequence I did not recognize. A section of the wall lit up, displaying a name and a set of dates I had never seen before in any history lesson I had ever received. "There is someone I want you to meet," she said. "He does not often speak with people your age, or honestly, with anyone at all these days. But given what you saw, I think he will make an exception." She led me down a long corridor, away from the noise of the command deck, into a quieter section of the station reserved, as far as I could tell, almost entirely for storage and old records. At the end of the corridor was a single door, unmarked, guarded by two officers who nodded to Helen without a word and stepped aside. Inside was a small room, dimly lit, filled with old data terminals and physical books, the kind almost nobody kept anymore. Sitting in a chair near the far wall was an old man, older than anyone I had ever met in person, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed as though he had been waiting for us. "Director Marsh," he said, without opening his eyes. "It has been some time." "Not long enough by the feel of things," Helen replied. "Elias, this is Daniel Cross. He was on Calder Station when the alarm came through." The old man, Elias, finally opened his eyes and looked at me. They were pale, almost colorless, but sharp in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Helen's own gaze. "Sit down, young man," he said. "You have questions. I imagine you have quite a few." I sat in the chair across from him, unsure exactly where to begin. Helen remained standing near the door, arms folded, watching the two of us with an expression I could not quite read. "Everyone keeps telling me there is something I do not understand," I said finally, "about the truce, about what happens now that it has been broken. Nobody will just tell me what that is." Elias smiled, though there was no humor in it. "That is because most people alive today do not know it themselves." "Not really. History has a way of smoothing out its own sharp edges over enough centuries. What you have been taught about the truce is true, as far as it goes. It simply does not go far enough." "Then tell me the rest." He studied me for a long moment before continuing. 900 years ago, humanity was not the quiet, careful species you see today. We were young, out among the stars for the first time, spreading quickly, meeting other species for the first time in circumstances that were not always peaceful. There was a war, a long one. It did not begin because of us, not entirely, but by the time it ended, very few species in this region of the galaxy wanted to test whether humanity could be pushed a second time. Pushed to do what? Elias's expression did not change, but something in his voice grew heavier. To do what we are very good at, Daniel, when given no other choice. We did not win that war through numbers. We did not win it through superior technology. Not at first. We won it because, when every other option had failed, humanity stopped treating survival as something to hope for and started treating it as something to simply decide. I did not fully understand what he meant, not yet, but the weight of his words settled over me anyway, the same way the silence in the corridors had settled over me the night before. After the war ended, Elias continued, the surviving species came together and asked us for something unusual. Not surrender, not tribute. They asked us to promise never to become that version of ourselves again unless we were given no choice, and in exchange, they promised to respect a line around our territory that no one would ever cross with weapons drawn. For 900 years, both sides kept that promise. Until yesterday, I said quietly. Until yesterday, he agreed. Helen finally spoke from her position near the door. The reason every species on Calder Station reacted the way they did, Daniel, is because they were not afraid of what humanity might do. They were afraid because they know exactly what we are capable of once that promise is broken, and they have spent 900 years hoping they would never have to see it firsthand. I sat there in that quiet room, surrounded by old books and older machines, trying to reconcile the version of humanity I had grown up believing in with the version Elias had just described. We were the polite ones, the careful ones, the species that always tried diplomacy first, patience first, calm words first. I had believed, my whole life, that this was simply who we were. Now I understood it had been a choice, a promise, kept for 900 years, out of respect for an agreement we ourselves had asked for as much as anyone else had. What happens now? I asked. Elias closed his eyes again, as though the question itself tired him. Now the people who attacked Meridian will learn something the rest of the galaxy has spent 9 centuries trying very hard to forget. And what is that? He opened his eyes one final time, and for just a moment, I saw something in them that was not quite sorrow and not quite anger, but some old, tired combination of both. That the quiet ones were never quiet because they were weak, he said. They were quiet because they were choosing, every single day, not to be anything else. I left that room with more questions than I had walked in with, but one thing had become perfectly clear to me. Whatever was coming, it was not going to be decided by shouting, or by panic, or by anger. It was going to be decided calmly, deliberately, by people who had spent 900 years holding something back, and who were now, for the first time in living memory, being allowed to let it go. Outside, through the narrow window at the end of the corridor, I could see the fleet still gathering, more ships arriving by the hour, each one sliding into formation with the same unsettling discipline I had noticed the day before. Nobody was rushing. Nobody needed to be told what to do. They had simply been waiting, quietly, patiently, for 900 years, for someone to finally give them a reason. 3 days later, I was given clearance to remain on the fleet command deck as an observer, a decision Helen Marsh made herself, though she never fully explained why. I suspected it was because I had been on Calder Station when everything began, and someone in command wanted a witness who understood both sides, the alien reaction and the human one, close enough to compare them without confusion. Whatever the reason, it meant I was standing near the main display when the second attack happened. It came without warning, the same way the first one had. A small human research outpost near the border, nothing military, nothing significant enough to explain why anyone would target it, went dark in the middle of what should have been a routine data transfer. The transfer simply stopped, mid-sentence, as though someone had reached out and closed a hand around it. The room did not erupt into shouting. It did not need to. Every officer on that deck simply stopped what they were doing for a single, silent second, the way the aliens on Calder Station had frozen when the first alarm sounded. Then, just as quickly, they returned to their stations and continued working, faster now, more focused, but still without a single raised voice. Helen appeared at my side moments later, her expression unreadable. "They are not stopping," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "Who are they?" I asked. "Nobody has told me who actually did this." She hesitated, then gestured for me to follow her to a private terminal at the edge of the room. She typed in a clearance code and pulled up a set of records I had never seen before, images and reports describing a coalition of smaller powers along the outer edge of known space, a group calling themselves the Kaith Alliance. I had heard of them before, vaguely, the way you hear about a distant country you will probably never visit. They were not one of the major species who had signed the original truce. They were younger, more recently arrived on the galactic stage, and apparently far more willing to test old agreements they had never personally witnessed being enforced. "They believe the truce is a story," Helen said, "an old fear passed down through generations who never saw the war themselves. They believe humanity has simply been weak for 900 years, and that the rest of the galaxy has been too cautious to test that weakness directly. So they are testing it themselves." Yes. I looked back at the display, at the quiet, focused faces of the officers working around us. And what happens if they are wrong? Helen did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost gentle, the way you might speak to someone right before delivering difficult news. "Then they are about to learn something the rest of the galaxy has spent 900 years being grateful they never had to learn twice." Over the following days, I watched the human response take shape, and it was unlike anything I had expected. There was no press conference filled with angry declarations, no broadcast threats, no public displays of force meant to intimidate. Instead, the response unfolded almost silently, ships repositioning with quiet precision, supply lines shifting, communication channels going dark one by one as command structures moved from open coordination to something far more controlled. I asked Owen Marsh about it during one of the rare moments he had time to speak with me. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "Why is everyone so calm?" I asked. "An entire outpost just went dark. People are gone. Why is nobody angry?" Owen considered the question carefully before answering. "Anger is loud, Daniel. Loud things are easy to predict. Loud things make mistakes." He paused. "What you are seeing is not the absence of anger. It is anger that has already been processed, already been accepted, and already been set aside in favor of something more useful." "Which is?" "Discipline," he said simply. "The same discipline that let us keep this promise for 900 years is the exact same discipline we now use to break it properly, if breaking it becomes necessary. We do not lose control when this happens, Daniel. That is the entire point. That is what frightened the rest of the galaxy in the first place, 900 years ago. Not that we could fight. Everyone can fight. What frightened them was that we could fight without ever losing ourselves in the process." I thought about that for a long time afterward, standing at the edge of the command deck, watching officers move calmly between stations while a war none of them wanted quietly began to take shape around us. Word reached us a few days later that the KF Alliance had sent a formal message to the wider Galactic Council, a message that Helen allowed me to view, though she warned me beforehand that I would not like what I read. The message was arrogant in a way that made my stomach turn, dismissing the truce as an outdated relic, claiming that humanity's silence over the centuries had been proof of weakness rather than restraint, and declaring that the Kaith Alliance intended to claim disputed border territories currently protected under the old agreement, regardless of what humanity chose to do about it. What struck me most, reading that message, was not the arrogance itself, but the reaction of the other species watching it unfold. Ambassadors from a dozen different worlds, species who had lived alongside humanity in careful peace for 900 years, began quietly reaching out to human command, not to offer support exactly, but to make it clear, in careful diplomatic language, that they would not interfere with whatever humanity chose to do in response. One message, from an elder representative of the Velkari Council, the same species Sona Ithrel belonged to, stood out to me more than the others. It was short, formal, and strangely personal for a diplomatic communication. "We remember," it read. We will not stand in your way. We only ask that you remember, as well, that most of us kept our word." I asked Helen what that meant, and she explained that the Velkari, along with most of the other major species who had signed the original truce, had spent 900 years honoring it completely, never testing it, never questioning it, simply trusting that humanity would do the same as long as they were not provoked. Their message was not a request for mercy toward the Kaith Alliance. It was a quiet reminder that the punishment being prepared was meant for the ones who broke the promise, not for the ones who had spent 9 centuries faithfully keeping it. "They are afraid this will spread," I said. "Afraid we will not be able to separate the guilty from the innocent once this begins." "They are afraid of exactly that," Helen agreed, "and it is a fair fear. It is also, I think, the reason Command has been so deliberate about every single decision made so far. This is not a war we intend to fight without limits, Daniel. It is a war we intend to fight with more discipline than anyone watching believes we are capable of, precisely because that discipline is the entire reason the truce existed in the first place." 2 more days passed before I finally understood, fully, what that discipline actually looked like in practice. I was called into a private briefing, one of only a handful of civilians present, alongside senior fleet officers and a small group of advisors I did not recognize. At the front of the room stood a woman I had not yet met, introduced simply as General Alan Kirby's second-in-command, a woman named Priya Whitlock, calm, composed, and utterly unshaken by the weight of the room around her. She laid out the plan for the response with the same steady tone someone might use to explain a routine supply schedule. Specific targets, specific limits, specific rules of engagement, designed not to punish an entire population for the actions of a small governing faction, but to remove the threat as precisely and completely as possible while minimizing harm to everyone else caught in the middle. What struck me most was not the plan itself, but the questions asked by the officers in the room. Nobody asked how quickly they could strike. Nobody asked how hard they could hit. Every single question was about precision, about limiting collateral damage, about making absolutely certain that whatever happened next would be remembered as controlled and deliberate rather than reckless or cruel. After the briefing ended, I found myself standing near Priya Whitlock as the room emptied. She glanced at me, apparently aware of who I was and why I had been included. "You look like a man with a question he is afraid to ask," she said. "Why does it matter so much?" I asked. "Being precise, being careful. If they attacked us, if they broke the truce first, why not simply respond with everything we have?" Priya considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because if we do that, Daniel, then the rest of the galaxy will have been right to fear us for 900 years, and we will have proven, the very first time we were tested, that their fear was never really about restraint at all. It was only ever about size, about scale, about how much damage we were capable of doing when finally let off the leash." She paused, glancing toward the window, where the fleet outside continued its silent, disciplined preparations. "We are not trying to prove that we are strong, Daniel. Everyone already knows that. We are trying to prove that strength was never the reason we were dangerous in the first place." I left that room with a strange, heavy feeling settling over me, one that would stay with me through everything that followed. For 900 years, the galaxy had feared humanity, not because of what we could destroy, but because of the terrifying possibility that we could destroy exactly what we intended to destroy, and stop the moment the task was finished, without losing ourselves anywhere in between. Now, for the first time in 9 centuries, the rest of the galaxy was about to watch that theory tested in person. And somewhere out past the border, the Kaith Alliance, confident in their belief that humanity's silence had always meant weakness, had no idea what they had actually woken up. I was not supposed to travel with the response fleet. Civilians rarely were, and observers even less so. But Helen Marsh made the case that someone needed to record events from a perspective that was neither purely military nor purely political, and General Alan Kirby, after a long silence over the comm channel, agreed to let me board one of the support vessels trailing behind the main formation. The ship I was assigned to was called the Halden, a mid-sized vessel meant for coordination and supply rather than direct combat, though even it carried more weaponry than anything I had seen up close before. I spent the first day of travel simply walking its corridors, trying to understand the mood of the crew around me, and finding, once again, the same unsettling calm I had encountered everywhere else since Calder Station. Nobody joked nervously to release tension. Nobody spoke in raised voices about what was coming. Crew members moved through their duties with quiet efficiency, checking systems, reviewing coordinates, occasionally speaking to one another in short, practical sentences that carried no unnecessary emotion at all. I found this more unsettling than any panic could have been. Panic, at least, would have felt familiar. On the second day, I was granted a short meeting with the Halden's commanding officer, a woman named Grace Alden, no relation to the ship's name as far as I could tell. She was younger than I expected for someone in her position, though her eyes carried the same tired weight I had noticed in Owen Marsh and Priya Whitlock. "You are the one from Calder Station," she said, not quite a question. "I am." "Then you already understand more of this than most of the people on this ship." She gestured for me to sit across from her small desk. "What do you want to know?" I hesitated before answering honestly. "I want to know if any of you are afraid." Grace considered the question carefully, the way everyone seemed to consider questions in this new, quieter version of humanity I had been thrust into. "Everyone on this ship is afraid, Daniel. We would be foolish not to be. Fear is not the problem. The problem would be letting that fear decide what we do next. How do you separate the two?" She almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. "Practice, discipline, 900 years of choosing, every single day, not to let our worst instincts make our decisions for us. It does not mean the instincts disappear. It only means we have learned, generation after generation, how to keep them where they belong, until we actually need them." I asked her, carefully, what she thought would happen once the fleet reached the border and encountered the Kaith Alliance directly. She did not answer with confidence or bravado. Instead, she answered with something closer to sadness. "I think a great many people who do not fully understand what they provoked are about to find out very quickly," she said. "And I think whatever happens, none of us on this ship will feel good about it afterward, no matter how necessary it turns out to be." That conversation stayed with me for the rest of the journey, echoing through every quiet corridor and every calm briefing that followed. This was not a fleet eager for a fight. This was a fleet that had simply run out of other options and intended to finish the task in front of them as quickly, precisely, and completely as possible without ever pretending to enjoy it. We reached the contested border region on the 6th day. I stood in the Halden's observation deck alongside a handful of other officers, watching through the reinforced viewport as the full scale of the assembled fleet became visible for the first time. Ships stretched out in every direction, more than I had ever seen gathered in one place, moving in perfect, silent formation, waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. Ahead of us, faint against the darkness of space, the Kaith Alliance forces had gathered as well, smaller in number but confident, arranged in aggressive formations that suggested they still believed, even now, that they held some advantage humanity had simply chosen not to use before. A transmission arrived from the Kaith Command, broadcast openly across all channels, clearly meant to be heard by every ship in the human fleet, as much as by their own forces. The voice on the other end was firm, almost mocking, declaring that humanity's long silence had finally been exposed for what it truly was, weakness dressed up as patience, and that any attempt to reclaim the disputed territories would be met with resistance they had prepared for over several years. I watched the faces of the officers around me as the message played. Nobody reacted with anger. A few exchanged brief, knowing glances, the kind people share when someone confidently repeats a story they do not realize is wrong. General Alan Kirby's response, broadcast a short time later across the same open channel, was brief, calm, and almost gentle in tone. "You were told this was a story," his voice said. "You were told the quiet meant nothing was there. We are not here to prove you wrong through cruelty. We are here to remind you why the story existed in the first place, and to make certain you remember it correctly this time." There was no further message after that, only silence, stretching between both fleets like a held breath. Then, without warning, without a countdown or a shouted order, the human fleet moved. I will not pretend to understand every detail of what followed. I was not trained in fleet tactics, and much of what happened occurred faster than my eyes could properly follow. What I remember most clearly was the discipline of it, The terrifying, precise discipline, ships moving exactly where they needed to be, weapons fire concentrated with pinpoint accuracy on specific targets rather than scattered indiscriminately across the battlefield. Entire sections of Kaith formations neutralized with almost surgical precision, while others nearby were left completely untouched, clearly deliberate rather than accidental. It was not chaos. It was the opposite of chaos. It was control, absolute and unwavering, applied with a precision that made the battle feel less like a fight and more like a demonstration. Within the first hour, it became clear the Kaith Alliance forces were badly outmatched, not simply in numbers or firepower, but in coordination itself. Their formations, confident and aggressive at the start, began to fracture as ship after ship found itself isolated, cut off from support, and neutralized before it could regroup. I watched several Kaith vessels attempt to retreat, and I watched, with a strange mixture of relief and unease, as human forces allowed those retreating ships to withdraw without pursuit, focusing instead only on those that continued to fight. Grace Alden, standing near me on the observation deck, noticed my expression and spoke quietly, almost to herself as much as to me. "We are not trying to destroy them," she said. "We are trying to stop them. There is a difference, and it matters more than most people watching from outside will ever understand." I asked her how command decided which ships to target and which to allow retreat. "Anyone still fighting is still a threat," she said. "Anyone retreating has already made their choice. We do not punish people for choosing to stop." I thought about Elias, the old man in the quiet room full of books, and the story he had told me about the war 900 years ago. I understood, watching the battle unfold with such careful restraint even in the middle of active combat, exactly what he had meant when he said humanity had won that ancient war not through overwhelming force, but through the terrifying ability to apply exactly the amount of force necessary and stop the moment it was no longer needed. The battle lasted just under 3 hours, though it felt both longer and shorter than that at the time. By the end, the majority of the Kaith Alliance's frontline forces had been neutralized, their remaining ships either retreating or surrendering outright, broadcasting formal requests for terms rather than continuing to fight a battle they now clearly understood they could not win. I expected celebration aboard the Halden once the fighting stopped. I expected relief, or triumph, or at least some visible release of the tension that had built for days. Instead, I found the same quiet discipline that had defined everything else since Calder Station. Crew members returning to their duties, officers reviewing damage reports, medical teams already preparing to assist wounded personnel on both sides of the conflict without hesitation or distinction. I found Grace Alden alone in a small observation room near the end of the ship, staring out at the wreckage, still drifting silently in the distance. She did not turn when I entered. "Is this what victory looks like?" I asked quietly. She was silent for a long moment before answering. "Victory is when nobody has to do this again for another 900 years, she said. "This is simply the cost of making sure that happens." I stood beside her, watching the drifting wreckage in silence, and understood, perhaps for the first time since the alarm had first sounded on Calder Station, exactly what Owen Marsh had meant when he told me humans clenched their knuckles not out of anger, but out of discipline finally being released after 900 years of careful restraint. The fighting was over, but something told me, watching Grace's tired, unreadable expression in that quiet room, that the hardest part of what came next was only just beginning. The days following the battle passed in a strange, quiet blur. The Kaith Alliance's formal surrender arrived less than a day after the fighting ended, delivered not by their military command, which had largely been neutralized, but by their civilian government, desperate to prevent any further engagement, and clearly shaken by how quickly their confidence had collapsed. I read the surrender terms alongside Helen Marsh, who had traveled out to join the fleet once the immediate danger had passed. The terms were, in a strange way, almost gentle. There were no demands for territory beyond what had already been disputed before the attack. There were no punishing reparations designed to cripple the Kaith economy for generations. Instead, the terms focused almost entirely on accountability, requiring the specific leaders who had ordered the attacks on Meridian and the research outpost to be handed over for formal judgment, while the wider Kaith population was left largely untouched. "This seems almost merciful," I said, reading through the document a second time. Helen glanced at me, a faint, tired smile crossing her face. "It is not mercy, Daniel. It is precision. We are not interested in punishing an entire population for the decisions of a small group of leaders who believed our silence meant weakness. Punishing everyone would only create more resentment, more fear, and eventually, more conflict down the line. We learned that lesson 900 years ago as well." I thought about that for a long time, remembering Priya Whitlock's words before the battle began, about proving that humanity's danger had never been about scale, but about control. The surrender terms felt like the final piece of that same lesson, applied not in battle, but in the aftermath, where it perhaps mattered even more. News of the battle spread quickly across the galaxy, and the reaction, when it came, was unlike anything I had expected. I had assumed, given how the rest of the galaxy had reacted with fear even before the fighting began, that the aftermath would bring some measure of relief, perhaps even celebration, that the danger had passed so quickly and so decisively. Instead, what I witnessed, through diplomatic channels and public broadcasts alike, was something closer to quiet, sober respect, mixed with a renewed and very careful caution. The Velkhari Council issued a formal statement within hours of the surrender, praising the discipline shown by human forces throughout the engagement, specifically noting the restraint applied even in the middle of active combat. I read the statement twice, struck by how carefully worded it was, clearly meant not simply to acknowledge what had happened, but to remind every other species watching exactly why the original truce had been created in the first place. Sona Ithrel reached out to me personally a few days later, the first time we had spoken since I left Calder Station. Her message was short, and when I read it, I understood immediately why she had chosen her words so carefully. "I am glad it is over," she wrote. "I am gladder still that it ended the way it did. We were afraid of what would happen if the story about humanity turned out to be true. I think, perhaps, we should have been more afraid of what would happen if it was not." I did not fully understand what she meant at first. It was only after speaking with Elias again, weeks later, that her words began to make sense to me. I returned to the quiet room full of old books and older machines shortly after the fleet made its way back toward human space. Elias was seated in the same chair, hands folded in his lap, as though he had not moved since the last time I visited. "You saw it then," he said, without opening his eyes. "The story made real." "I saw something," I said, sitting across from him. "I am not certain I fully understand what it was." Elias opened his eyes and studied me for a long moment. "What do you think you saw, Daniel?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "I saw discipline, precision, a fleet that fought exactly hard enough to stop the threat in front of it, and not 1 degree harder than that." "And what do you think that discipline actually is, at its core?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Elias, seeing my uncertainty, continued without waiting. "It is not a tactic, Daniel. It is not a strategy developed by clever generals studying old wars. It is a choice, made new every single day by every single person who carries it, to hold something back that could very easily be let loose without much effort at all. The Kaith Alliance believed our quiet meant we had nothing left to hold back. They were wrong. What they witnessed was not the full weight of what humanity is capable of. It was the smallest possible portion of that weight, applied with exactly enough force to solve the problem in front of us, and stopped the very moment it was no longer needed." "Why stop there?" I asked. "If we are capable of more, why not use it, and end every possible future threat permanently?" Elias's expression grew heavier at that question, older somehow, though he had already seemed impossibly old to begin with. "Because that is exactly the mistake we made once before, 900 years ago," he said quietly. "We were pushed into a war we did not start, and by the time it ended, we had used far more of ourselves than the situation ever required. We won that war, Daniel. But winning it cost us something we did not fully understand the value of until long after it was gone. The truce was not simply a promise to the rest of the galaxy. It was a promise to ourselves, that we would never again let a threat convince us to become more than the situation actually demanded." I sat with that answer for a long time, the weight of it settling over me the same way the silence had settled over Calder Station, the same way it had settled over every quiet corridor and every careful briefing since. Is that why everyone was so afraid, even before the fighting began? I asked. Not because we might lose control, but because we might not? Elias smiled, faintly, for the first time since I had met him. You are beginning to understand, Daniel. The rest of the galaxy was never truly afraid of humanity losing itself in anger. They were afraid of exactly what they eventually witnessed, a species capable of enormous strength, choosing again and again precise restraint instead. That kind of discipline is far more unsettling to witness than simple rage ever could be, because rage can be predicted, and reasoned with, and eventually exhausted. Discipline like ours has no such limits. It simply continues, exactly as needed, for as long as needed, without ever losing its shape. I left that quiet room for the final time with a new understanding of everything that had happened since that first alarm sounded on Calder Station. The galaxy had not broken the truce because they believed humanity was strong. They had tested it, in a small and reckless way, because a handful of leaders had convinced themselves that our silence over 9 centuries meant that strength no longer existed at all. They had been wrong, and the correction, when it came, had been swift, precise, and, in its own strange way, almost gentle. Months later, I returned to Calder Station, reassigned to my old post now that the immediate crisis had passed. Sona met me at the docking bay personally, something she had never done before in all my previous years there. You look different, she said, studying my face carefully. I feel different, I admitted. We walked together through the same corridors I had walked 100 times before, past the same observation window where she had once pressed her hand against the glass as I departed for what I had believed, at the time, might be the beginning of something far worse than what actually unfolded. The others are still nervous around your kind, she admitted, as we reached the window. Not afraid, exactly, just careful, more careful than before. Is that a bad thing? Sona considered the question. I do not think so. I think perhaps it is simply the correct amount of caution. We forgot, for 900 years of peace, exactly what we agreed to respect. Now we remember, and I suspect we will not forget again for quite some time. I looked out at the same view I had looked at the day everything began. The docking bay, the ships coming and going, the quiet, ordinary rhythm of a station slowly returning to normal after everything that had happened. Do you regret it? Sona asked quietly. What your people had to do? I thought about Grace Alden, standing silently in that observation room after the battle ended, staring out at the drifting wreckage without a single trace of triumph on her face. I thought about Priya Whitlock's careful explanation of precision over destruction, and Elias's tired, ancient eyes describing a war fought long before either of us had been born. No, I said finally, I do not think anyone regrets stopping something that needed to be stopped. I think, perhaps, everyone simply wishes it had never needed stopping in the first place. Sona nodded slowly, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything else. We simply stood together at that window, watching the quiet, ordinary business of the galaxy continue around us, the same way it had for 900 years before the truce had ever been tested, and the same way, I suspected, it would continue for a long while yet. Somewhere far behind us, on a world called Meridian that had once gone silent in the space of 11 seconds, rebuilding had already begun, slow and careful, the same way everything about humanity's response had been slow and careful, from the very first moment the alarm sounded. I thought back to that first day, standing at the observation window on this very station, watching every alien around me freeze at the exact same instant, and I understood now, in a way I had not understood then, exactly what that fear had actually meant. It had never been fear of what we might become. It had always been fear of what we had simply, quietly, chosen not to be, for 900 years, out of nothing more than a promise we intended to keep. And now that the promise had finally been tested, and finally proven true, the hands that had clenched so tightly in those first uncertain days could at last begin to slowly, carefully unclench.